In the smoke-filled dawn of September 11th, 2001, as sirens screamed across Manhattan and ash drifted like snow over the city, a single figure found himself thrust into a story far larger than anything he had ever built. Larry Silverstein, the real estate magnate who had spent decades transforming the New York skyline, watched the destruction of the World Trade Center with a mixture of horror, disbelief, and a responsibility so immense it bordered on unbearable. Just 7 weeks earlier, he had secured the lease to the very towers now collapsing before his eyes. It was a detail so improbable, so brutally timed, that it would become the seed for decades of speculation, suspicion, and relentless public examination. In the world of high-stakes real estate, timing is everything. But rarely does timing cut this sharply. For years, Silverstein had pursued the deal with an almost monastic persistence. Competitors had deeper pockets and broader influence, yet he outmaneuvered them all. He signed the final documents on July 24, 2001, a date that would later seem as haunting as a countdown clock. To those who worked alongside him, it was the culmination of a lifetime spent climbing through the upper tiers of New York's property empire. To millions watching from afar, it would eventually raise a more unsettling question. How could one man's life intersect so closely with a national catastrophe through pure coincidence alone? The financial architecture behind the lease was intricate, the sort of framework that requires entire teams of lawyers to decipher. Silverstein's own investment was relatively small compared to the total value of the lease. Banks and financial backers filled in the rest. But the real complexity lay in the insurance agreements. He had taken out coverage that spanned numerous companies, each holding a piece of the potential liability. The wording of those policies, specifically the definition of an occurrence, would soon become a linchpin in one of the largest insurance disputes in history. 2 towers, 2 airplanes, 1 coordinated attack. How should the law interpret that? To the insurers, it was 1 event. To Silverstein, it was 2. And the difference between those interpretations added up to billions. Every documentary and investigative report that followed returned to this point, not because it suggested wrongdoing, but because it illustrated a deeper truth about human nature. When tragedy and money collide, even the most ordinary business decisions begin to look sinister under the public microscope. People are drawn to the idea of hidden motives and secret advantages, especially when the alternative explanation, simple, merciless chance, offers no emotional satisfaction. True investigations don't rely on innuendo, but they do follow patterns, and in this story, the pattern was one of extraordinary misfortune intersecting with extraordinary financial stakes. In the aftermath of the attacks, Silverstein was not only grappling with the destruction of his newly acquired property, he was grieving. He had nearly been in the North Tower himself that morning, only avoiding his routine visit because his wife insisted he keep a dermatologist appointment. A trivial decision, one that takes seconds, had placed him out of harm's way. It's the kind of coincidence that would normally pass unnoticed, yet in a tragedy of this scale, such details acquire a strange, haunting resonance. They feel almost scripted by fate, which makes them difficult for a grieving public to accept without suspicion. In 2002, during a televised interview, Silverstein uttered a line that would take on a life of its own. "Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it." He later clarified that he was referring to withdrawing firefighters from a building on the verge of collapse, not ordering a demolition. But once spoken, the phrase became fuel for endless reinterpretation. Investigative minds, both earnest and misguided, pored over the wording, replaying it as if examining a confession. It didn't matter that no evidence supported any dark implication. What mattered was that the phrase sounded like something it wasn't. In high-pressure moments, language can betray the speaker, and the public's imagination rarely grants the benefit of the doubt. The courtroom battles that followed were not dramatic in the cinematic sense, but they were monumental in scale. Expert witnesses debated structural failure, legal scholars dissected policy definitions, and teams of lawyers fought over technical language buried in contracts. Silverstein argued that each plane constituted a separate occurrence, doubling the potential payout. The insurers pushed back with equal force. The final outcome landed somewhere in between, a partial victory for Silverstein, but never the full amount he sought. The money was ultimately funneled into rebuilding efforts and financial obligations, yet the sheer magnitude of theisms involved left shadows that lingered long after the verdicts. Investigators and journalists who analysed the case often reached the same conclusion. There was no hidden conspiracy, no secret plot, no crime behind the timing or the insurance. And yet, even in the absence of wrongdoing, the story still feels like a true crime narrative, not because of criminal acts, but because of the atmosphere that surrounds them. The ingredients are all there: staggering sums of money, improbable timing, tragic loss, and a central figure whose life was irrevocably altered by forces beyond his control. It is the kind of story that invites scrutiny simply by existing. What makes Silverstein's role so compelling is not guilt, innocence, or motive. It is the emotional tension at the core of the narrative, the human struggle to reconcile coincidence with catastrophe. People naturally seek patterns. When the stakes are high, those patterns begin to look like clues, and when grief magnifies every detail, even the simplest decisions, a doctor's appointment, a rephrased sentence, a newly signed contract, seem to demand deeper examination. But investigation is not the same as suspicion, and suspicion is not the same as truth. The truth, in this case, is that a businessman found himself standing at the epicenter of a national tragedy by sheer, brutal chance. As the reconstruction of the World Trade Center began, Silverstein became both a symbol and a target. To some, he was the determined force pushing for revival, a man refusing to let destruction define the future of Lower Manhattan. To others, he represented the uneasy intersection of money and disaster, a reminder that even in moments of profound grief, financial interests do not dissolve. The complexity of that position made him harder to categorize, easier to question, and forever tied to a moment in history he did not choose. Looking back, what stands out most is not any particular action he took, but the way his story reveals something universal about human response to tragedy. When events are too massive to comprehend, we search for narratives that make sense of them. We look for villains, motives, hidden layers, anything to restore a sense of order. But sometimes, the hardest truth to accept is the simplest one: that life can align itself in ways so cruel and coincidental that they defy explanation without offering any mystery to solve. The story of Larry Silverstein is not the story of a crime, but it is undeniably the story of an investigation. An investigation into chance, timing, perception, and the way we try to impose meaning on the meaningless. His presence in the narrative of 9/11 forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, coincidence, and the fragile boundary between suspicion and fact. And in the end, the most dramatic element of his story is not that he controlled the tragedy, but that he was powerless before it, caught in a moment where history, fate, and catastrophe collided in a way no one could have foreseen. Do you want to know my personal opinion? Okay, here it is. Larry Silverstein paid 14 million euros of his own money for the lease contract of the WTC Towers 1, 2, 4, and 5. So, 4 towers. After this deal was closed, he insured the WTC buildings. The insurance policy was signed by 24 insurance providers for a total of $3.55 billion per case of property damage. This later became a point of dispute between Silverstein and the insurance companies, because Silverstein considered the attacks to be 2 separate cases, 1 case per aircraft impact. But the insurance companies argued that both plane attacks counted as a single case. Setting aside whether it was 1 or 2 cases, if you put down 14 million for a lease contract, and you can then receive 3.55 billion per damage claim, let's assume he succeeded in having the towers counted as 2 separate claims, then Larry Silverstein, with an investment of 14 million euros, would have received more than 7 billion euros afterward. If you take 7 billion euros and subtract 14 million euros, you get 6.986 billion euros remaining. That is the profit Larry Silverstein made from leasing the WTC Towers.